Karl Heinrich Marx was born on the 5th of May, 1818, in Trier, an ancient city on the Moselle River in what is now Western Germany. The Romans had built it. When Marx arrived, its oldest monuments were nearly 2,000 years old, and you could feel that in the stone, in the Porta Nigra gate still standing at the city's edge. In the amphitheater, half buried in the hillside, it was, in other words, a city where history was physically present, in a way that would have been hard to ignore for a boy who would eventually make history his life's subject. His family carried its own layered history, Jewish by heritage, descended on both sides from a long line of rabbis, his paternal grandfather having served as chief rabbi of Trier and his maternal grandfather as a rabbi in Holland. His father, Heinrich, had converted to Lutheranism in 1816, 2 years before Karl was born, not out of genuine religious conviction, but out of practical necessity. A law had been passed barring Jews from practicing law and from holding civil positions. Heinrich Marx was a lawyer who admired Voltaire and Kant and who believed in the Enlightenment ideal that reason could improve the world. Conversion was simply the price of the career he needed to sustain. Karl was baptized in the same church at the age of 6 and grew up in a household shaped by that compromise, by a father who had traded one identity for another, just to be allowed to work. Trier itself was a troubled town. By some estimates, a quarter of its residents were dependent on charity by the time Marx was a teenager, and poverty was visible in the streets. One of the few people in Trier who spoke openly about the connection between poverty and political structure was Ludwig von Westphalen, the government councillor in Trier, a baron by lineage, who read the French socialists and believed society had a responsibility to those at the bottom of it, not just those at the top. Marx walked for hours along the banks of the Moselle River with him, listening to him recite Homer and Dante and Shakespeare from memory. Somewhere in those walks, the teenage Karl also fell quietly and irreversibly in love with Ludwig's daughter. Jenny von Westphalen was 4 years older than Karl, exceptionally well-read, and known throughout Trier's social circles as one of the most sought-after young women in town. She had suitors from good families, men with money, rank, and comfortable futures. She broke off an engagement to a Prussian lieutenant, reportedly over his willingness to fire on protesters, and chose instead the young radical with no money, no connections, and no prospects. They became secretly engaged in 1836. Karl was 18. Jenny was 22. The engagement stayed secret for years, because it was, by any measure, a strange match. What Karl had to offer was almost entirely invisible to the casual observer. Clearly brilliant, clearly restless. But brilliant and restless don't pay rent. He went to university at Bonn in October of 1835. The experience was not a particularly academic one. He was imprisoned once for being drunk and disorderly. He fought a duel. He ran up debts. He joined a poets' club monitored by the police. His father, increasingly alarmed, transferred him after 1 year to the far more rigorous University of Berlin. He arrived in Berlin in the autumn of 1836, a brash 18-year-old from the provinces, and almost immediately found himself drawn into a circle of thinkers wrestling with ideas that would occupy him for the rest of his life. At the center of those ideas was Hegel. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel had taught at the University of Berlin until his death in 1831, and his philosophy still filled the intellectual air of the place 5 years later. The argument that history was not random, but a rational dialectical process in which ideas clash with their opposites, synthesize into something new, and drive the world forward. Marx initially found Hegel's writing impossibly dense and frustratingly abstract, but he kept reading, and somewhere around the age of 20, something resolved. He joined the Young Hegelians, a group of radical students and intellectuals who took Hegel's framework and turned it toward criticism of religion, political authority, and the comfortable assumptions of German middle-class life. Where the older, conservative Hegelians argued that the existing Prussian state was the rational endpoint of history, the young Hegelians maintained that history was still moving. Marx's doctoral thesis, submitted to the University of Jena in 1841, compared the ancient philosophers Democritus and Epicurus and their different approaches to materialism and freedom. It was a daring piece of work for a 23-year-old, and it already showed the thing that would define his entire intellectual life, a relentless insistence on looking at the actual material world, rather than staying safely in the realm of pure abstraction. He had hoped for a university teaching position, the obvious path for a young philosopher. The Prussian government, however, was cracking down on academics with radical views. Several of his young Hegelian colleagues were denied positions. Bruno Bauer, his closest friend and collaborator, lost his post at Bonn. The academic door closed entirely, so Marx became a journalist. He joined the Rheinische Zeitung, the Rhineland Gazette, in Cologne in 1842, hired as a contributor, and within months had become its editor. At the age of 24, the paper dealt in ideas that made the Prussian authorities nervous: press freedom, economic conditions for Prussian peasants, the poverty of wine farmers in the Moselle region, the gap between how people actually lived and what the official story of Prussian prosperity claimed. Marx wasn't yet writing about communism or class struggle, but he was already doing what he would always do, looking at concrete conditions, real human suffering, and asking whose interests were served by the arrangements that produced it. The Prussian government shut the paper down in early 1843. At 25, Marx had just lost his editorial position, had been engaged for 7 years with no steady income, and was living in a country growing increasingly hostile to his kind of thinking. He and Jenny were married in June of 1843. Finally, after 7 years of waiting, in a small church in Bad Kreuznach. But there was loss in it too. Neither of their fathers was alive to see the wedding, both having died in the preceding years. That autumn, they moved to Paris. Paris in those years was alive with socialist thought, working-class organizing, and debates about property and labor that were urgent and immediate in a way that Berlin's philosophical seminars had never been. Marx had been thinking about these things in the abstract for years. In Paris, he encountered them in the flesh. He founded a journal called the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, the German-French yearbooks, which produced exactly one issue before collapsing for lack of subscribers and Prussian government interference. But in that one issue, Marx published two things that matter: an essay calling for an uprising of the proletariat to bring philosophy down from the clouds and into the streets, and the essay containing his famous line about religion being the opium of the people, not a throwaway provocation, but an argument that religion offered people a consoling illusion in place of the real change their real suffering demanded. Also in Paris, in early 1844, he met Friedrich Engels for the first time in person. And this is where things get interesting. Engels was the son of a wealthy German textile manufacturer with factories in Manchester. He had gone to work there and come back transformed by what he'd seen. Children working 16-hour days, workers packed into slums without clean water, wages driven to the barest edge of survival by market competition. He had written about it. He was finishing a book on it. Marx, reading his work, recognized the relationship immediately. Here was the theory. Here was the evidence. Their partnership was complementary in the way that great partnerships sometimes are. Engels more practical and journalistic, Marx more philosophical and systematic. Engels had money. Marx had never had any, and seemed constitutionally incapable of accumulating it. In Paris, working through the summer and autumn of 1844, Marx also produced a set of notebooks he never published. Set aside, seemingly unsatisfied, overtaken by other urgencies. Those notebooks would not appear in full until 1932, nearly 90 years after they were written. When they did, they reframed the entire debate about what Marxism actually was at its core. The economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 contain the clearest and most personal statement of a concept that runs beneath everything Marx would go on to argue: alienation. Under capitalism, Marx wrote, work does not feel like an expression of human capacity. The way a craftsperson might experience making something beautiful and useful, or a thinker might experience following an argument to its conclusion. Instead, the worker experiences work as something external, something endured for someone else's benefit, producing something that then exists independently of them, and in some sense against them. The product belongs to the factory owner. The labor belongs to the factory owner. The worker sells their time and their energy, and receives just enough to return tomorrow and sell them again. What should be the most essentially human activity, making things, shaping the world, expressing capacity through labor, becomes instead a thing to be escaped. These were still notebooks, still raw, but the argument was there, running like a subterranean current beneath everything he would write for the rest of his life. The Prussian government got Marx expelled from France in early 1845. He went to Brussels, Belgium, and Engels followed. They kept writing, together and separately, including a fierce demolition of their former young Hegelian colleagues titled The German Ideology, a book never published in Marx's lifetime, but one that laid out for the first time the full framework of what he was calling historical materialism. The idea that history is driven not by the clash of ideas, but by the material conditions of human life. Who owns what, who works for whom, who gets to eat, and who doesn't. The Brussels years had a strange double quality. Intellectually, they were perhaps the most productive of his life up to that point. Economically, they were desperate. Jenny had given birth to their first child in Paris. Their second was born in Brussels. The family was regularly bailed out by small inheritances or emergency loans from Engels. They pawned whatever small possessions they had when nothing else remained. Jenny went to relatives begging for loans and came back empty-handed. Then, in November of 1847, a letter arrived from London. It came from the Communist League, a secret society of mostly German workers living in exile in England. They wanted a document, a statement of principles, a manifesto. Marx attended their Congress in November 1847, held in the upstairs room of a pub on Great Windmill Street called the Red Lion. He spoke, he debated, he won the room, and he was asked, along with Engels, to write the document the organization needed. He wrote quickly. The deadline pressure was real. The Communist League's London leadership had sent a letter threatening consequences if the document wasn't delivered. He worked through December of 1847 and into January of 1848, and produced what became known, after its original German title, as the Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. 23 pages long, dark green cover, published in London on the 21st of February 1848. The opening line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." The closing line, addressed to the workers of the world, workers of all countries, unite. Between those two lines, Marx laid out a vision of history as the story of class struggle, the constant conflict between those who own the means of production and those who work them. He argued that capitalism, for all its productive power, contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The more it concentrated wealth in fewer hands, the larger and more organized and more desperate the working class would become, and eventually that working class would rise and take ownership of the means of production for themselves. The pamphlet had almost no immediate impact. Published in German for an audience of German exiles, in an edition too small to ripple outward, it was received in near silence. But even as the pamphlet was coming off the press in London, Europe was igniting. The revolutions of 1848, sometimes called the Spring of Nations, sometimes the Year of Revolutions, began in Paris in late February and spread with extraordinary speed across the continent, to the German states, to Austria, to Hungary, to Italy. Decades of compressed frustration with aristocratic rule, with poverty, with the denial of constitutional rights, released in a single coordinated eruption. Marx threw himself in. Revolutionary journalism, democratic congresses, writing furiously about what was unfolding. And then it collapsed. The revolutions of 1848 failed. One by one, the forces of reaction regrouped. Armies loyal to the old powers put down the uprisings. Democratic movements were crushed or co-opted. By spring of 1849, the counter-revolution had won. Prussia expelled Marx. France wouldn't take him. Belgium wouldn't have him. He was 31 years old, with a wife, 3 young children, and no country in the world that would keep him. In August of 1849, he arrived in London with almost nothing, expecting to stay temporarily, certain that revolutionary fires would reignite on the continent soon. He never left. Soho in the early 1850s was not a pleasant place to live, impoverished and overcrowded, with an average of 14 people per house across the neighborhood, and disease a constant presence. The family's first flat in Chelsea was too expensive and they were evicted, then moved to Dean Street in Soho. 3 small rooms on the upper floor of a building whose ground floor served as a restaurant and as a gathering point for German exiles. During those Dean Street years, 2 of Marx and Jenny's children died. Their son, Heinrich, called Little Guido, was born in November of 1849 and died 14 months later. Jenny wrote later about not having money for a cradle, about bailiffs arriving at the flat and stripping whatever small possessions the family had accumulated to cover overdue rent. Then Franziska, born in 1851, died in April of 1852 at less than 13 months old. Jenny described having no money for a coffin, a neighbor lending them £2 just to bury the child. Their son Edgar died in 1855 at the age of 8 from intestinal tuberculosis that his weakened, undernourished body couldn't fight off. Marx was devastated by each of these deaths, in ways his letters make plain. He was a devoted father who told his daughters elaborate stories and loved them fiercely. He could not, however, abandon the project he had committed himself to, even as the cost of that commitment extracted itself from everyone around him. Every morning, or most mornings when his health allowed, he walked 15 minutes from Dean Street to the British Museum. His preferred seat was G7. The worn patch on the floor in front of that seat was said to have been made by his feet. He kept returning, day after day, because he was building something vast. filling notebook after notebook with references, data, and careful analysis of how the economy actually worked, not as the political economists who preceded him described it, not as a system of rational exchange between free individuals, but as a system in which the surplus value created by labor was systematically captured by those who owned the means of production. Engels, meanwhile, was keeping him alive. He had returned to Manchester, gone back to working in his father's textile business, doing the thing he always found distasteful, in order to provide Marx with the funds to keep writing. Marx wrote for the New York Daily Tribune for about 10 years, between 1851 and 1862, as their European correspondent covering politics, economics, and foreign affairs. He was read by hundreds of thousands of Americans who had no idea they were reading Karl Marx, not the version most people tell. His journalism during these years reveals a thinker whose scope extended far beyond the European working class he is most associated with. He wrote about British colonization of India with uncomfortable ambivalence. On Ireland, his conclusions were sharper and harder. The oppression of Irish workers served, he argued, as a mechanism for dividing the English working class. English workers taught to look down on Irish immigrant workers competing for the same jobs. As long as that division persisted, solidarity was impossible. And in 1864, it was Marx who drafted the International Workingmen's Association's letter of congratulation to Abraham Lincoln on his re-election, expressing the hope that the end of chattel slavery would open the way to a broader emancipation on both sides of the Atlantic. Lincoln's secretary replied, "The Illinois lawyer turned war president, and the German exile in a Soho garret, briefly in correspondence, about what the future of human freedom might look like. I find that detail genuinely strange, in the best possible way." Then, in 1867, after nearly 2 decades of work, the first volume of Das Kapital was published. 1 volume out of a projected 3, published in Hamburg by a small press in German. Sales were modest. Reviews were sparse. Engels wrote several reviews himself under pseudonyms to try to generate attention, but the book was out. The argument was there. Where the Manifesto had been a call to action, be urgent, passionate, designed to move people, Kapital was something else, dense, technical, a scientific work in the mode that 19th century science understood that word. Marx wanted to do for economics what Darwin had done for biology in 1859, reveal the underlying mechanism, the deep structure beneath the visible surface. In 1871, before he could finish it, an event occurred that tested his theories against reality with unusual directness. When France was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War and Napoleon III's government collapsed, the workers and National Guard units of Paris refused to surrender their weapons to the new conservative Versailles government. For 72 days, from the 18th of March to the 28th of May, the Paris Commune governed the city. It was a self-organized experiment in workers' democracy unlike anything that had existed at scale before. Elected officials subject to immediate recall, a standing army replaced by an armed citizenry, church and state separated, education made free. Marx watched from London, with what can only be described as agonized attentiveness. And here is where things get strange. He had warned commune leaders through the International that the timing was wrong, that they lacked the organized strength to hold power against the full military force of the French state. When the Commune was established anyway, he shifted immediately and entirely to supporting it. Because here, in the real and breathing world, was the thing he had been theorizing for 20 years. The Versailles army retook Paris in the final week of May. in what came to be called Bloody Week, La Semaine Sanglante, killing somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 communards in the streets, in courtyards, against cemetery walls. Marx understood what the Commune had revealed. It was not enough to seize power. You had to hold it, and holding required preparation, discipline, and an organizational capacity the Commune had simply not had time to build. He never finished it. Volumes 2 and 3 were assembled by Engels from Marx's manuscripts after his death, and the incompleteness was, in some ways, the result of a perfectionism that could never quite be satisfied. He kept finding material that complicated the picture, kept revising, kept pursuing threads into new areas. In his final years, he taught himself Russian, so he could read Russian economic statistics directly. He filled 50 notebooks in the last decade of his life. Jenny, his wife, developed liver cancer in the mid-1870s and died on the 2nd of December, 1881. Marx's eldest daughter, Jenny Caroline, died just 6 weeks later, on the 11th of January, 1883. Marx himself, already ill and in grief, died on the 14th of March, 1883, less than 3 months after his daughter. He was 64 years old. The cause was pleurisy, made worse by chronic bronchitis. His friend and doctor found him dead in his armchair in the afternoon, alone in his study. 11 people attended the funeral at Highgate Cemetery in North London. His 3 surviving daughters, Jenny Caroline, Laura, and Eleanor, had inherited his intensity and his politics in ways that made their lives almost impossible to separate entirely from his. Laura Marx had married Paul Lafargue, a Cuban-born French socialist who helped found the French Workers' Party. Lafargue became famous for a pamphlet called The Right to be Lazy, a deliberately provocative piece arguing that workers should demand less work rather than simply better wages, which can be read, at least in part, as a gentle counter-argument to everything about the way Karl Marx had actually lived. Paul and Laura died together in 1911, in a planned double suicide, when both felt they had reached the end of what they could contribute to the movement they had given their lives to. They left a note. They died in their home in Dravale, south of Paris. Eleanor, called Tussie, the youngest, the one Marx had called his third son because of her evident ferocity, became in some ways the most practically consequential of the 3. She was a labor organizer, a translator. She gave public readings of A Doll's House at a time when Ibsen's argument about a woman's right to leave an intolerable marriage was genuinely explosive. She spent her adult life carrying her father's work into places and among people he never reached. She died in 1898 at 43, apparently believing she was party to a mutual suicide pact with her partner, who did not take his dose, and who had, as it later emerged, secretly married another woman. She died alone on a Sunday morning. The pattern of the family, lives consumed by commitment, endings that don't resolve, runs right to the last generation. At the graveside, Engels gave a short speech. Just as Darwin had discovered the law of development of organic nature, Engels said, so Marx had discovered the law of development of human history. He said the name of Marx would endure through the centuries. At the moment of Marx's death, the question of whether that was true seemed genuinely open. He had been expelled from 3 countries. He had lived in poverty for most of his adult life. He had watched 4 children die. He had spent 30 years writing a vast work of economic theory that the wider world had barely registered. History, however, was about to make that assessment look entirely wrong. In the years immediately after his death, Marx's ideas spread through the European labor movement with accelerating speed. Trade unions adopted Marxist language. Socialist parties formed across Germany, France, Britain, and Russia. But it was 1917 that changed the scope of everything. In October of that year, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power from the provisional government in Russia. Lenin had been reading Marx since the 1880s and had built his entire political theory on Marxist foundations, adapted for a country that had not yet industrialized in the way Marx had assumed a socialist revolution would require. The ideological bedrock, however, was Marxist. The Soviet Union that emerged, and from Lenin's death and Stalin's rise, was not what Marx had envisioned. Marx had imagined socialist revolution coming first in the most advanced industrialized countries: Britain, Germany, the United States. What happened in the Soviet Union was something else, something that bore Marx's name, but had been transformed in application into something he could not have predicted and might not have recognized. This is one of the most contested questions in the history of political thought. How much responsibility does a thinker bear for what is done in their name? My own view is that the question has no clean answer, and that ambiguity is itself historically significant. The Marxist frameworks, the language of class struggle, the analysis of capitalism's contradictions, the vision of collective ownership of the means of production, were used to justify the Soviet Union under Stalin, the People's Republic of China under Mao, Cuba under Castro, and numerous other regimes across the 20th century. Some of what was done in Marx's name produced genuine reform, land redistribution, expanded literacy and healthcare, the dismantling of feudal structures, and some of what was done in Marx's name was catastrophic: the Gulag, mass starvation in Ukraine, the Great Leap Forward in China, the repression of political dissent on a scale that defies easy description. The ideas and the outcomes are connected, but the line between them is not straight, and tracing it requires more honesty than most ideological positions on any side are willing to offer. Meanwhile, in the capitalist countries that did not have Marxist revolutions, something quieter but arguably just as significant was occurring: the 8-hour workday, weekends, workplace safety regulations, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, universal health care across most of the industrialized world. These were not simply given. They were fought for by labor movements whose members often read Marx, whose arguments were shaped by Marxist analysis, and whose negotiating position was strengthened considerably by the fact that capitalist governments in the West were competing ideologically with the system that claimed to represent workers' interests. By the 1950s, roughly half the world's population lived under governments that described themselves in Marxist terms. By the 1980s and 1990s, as the Soviet model collapsed, many declared Marxism finished, proven wrong by history. And yet, the basic questions that Marx posed remain the basic questions. Who owns the means by which things are made? Who benefits from the value created by labor? What is the relationship between economic power and political power? Nobody across the spectrum of political opinion argues that he was irrelevant. Consider the alternatives. If Marx had not gone to Berlin, had stayed at Bonn and finished that undistinguished first year, the encounter with Hegel's philosophy that gave his thinking its essential shape might never have occurred. Without Engels, who provided both the empirical material from industrial capitalism and the financial lifeline that kept Marx writing, the trajectory changes completely. No Engels might mean no Manifesto, no Capital, or both in drastically different and far less influential forms. The most consequential counterfactual, however, is 1848. Marx was 30 years old that year, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers, and certain that history was moving in the direction he had theorized, if the revolutions had produced stable democratic governments across the German states, if the political opening had lasted rather than being crushed within a year. Marx might never have gone to London, never spent those grinding, poverty-stricken years in Dean Street, and might never have written Das Kapital. The failure of 1848 pushed him to London. London pushed him to the British Museum. The British Museum gave him the raw material. The raw material became capital, and capital, read by Lenin, became the ideological foundation of the Russian Revolution. This is what historians sometimes call the contingency of history, the way enormous consequences hinge on specific, seemingly small things. What if he had simply declined the commission, had written back to the Communist League in November of 1847 and told them he was too busy? The League would have asked someone else, almost certainly a less systematic thinker, without the philosophical rigor, without the ability to synthesize political economy and historical analysis and philosophical method into a single framework. Would there still have been a Russian Revolution? Possibly. The conditions that produced it, the grinding poverty of Russian peasants and workers, the rigidity of czarist autocracy, the strains of the First World War, might well have produced some kind of revolutionary upheaval regardless. But it would have been a different revolution. Lenin without Marx is not Lenin. History, as always, was not inevitable. What we know is what actually happened. Karl Marx sat down in January of 1848, Turkon, in a cold apartment in Brussels, and wrote a pamphlet he thought was for a small organization of German workers in exile. He could not have known that the pamphlet would be translated into dozens of languages, reprinted hundreds of times, and read by hundreds of millions of people over the following century and a half. He could not have known that its opening words, "A specter is haunting Europe," would become some of the most quoted sentences in political history. He was wrong about some things. The revolution he predicted did not come in the advanced industrial countries. The working class did not spontaneously develop the revolutionary consciousness he anticipated. Capitalism proved more adaptable and more durable than he expected, able to absorb shocks, to reform itself, to redistribute just enough to forestall the crisis he theorized as inevitable. But he was right about other things. The tendency of capital to concentrate, the global reach of capitalist markets, the way economic power translates into political power, the way work under capitalism can become alienating, a thing done for someone else's benefit, disconnected from one's own capacities and desires. In a world where a handful of individuals hold more wealth than billions of people combined, these observations have not dated. A few things about Marx are easy to forget given the scale of what his name eventually came to mean. He was funny. His letters are full of dark, sharp humor, and he made puns in 3 languages. He loved his daughters deeply, told them elaborate stories, and on Sundays walked with the whole family on Hampstead Heath, picnicking on the grass above London. He was a man of considerable vanity about his ideas, and very little about his appearance, and he was genuinely incapable of managing money, not willfully reckless, but constitutionally unable to keep track of it in the way that makes a household function. When Jenny died in December of 1881, Marx had only 15 months left to live. He told a friend shortly after her death that she had consumed the best part of his life. The grief was total and physical, a collapse that contributed directly to his own decline. He never saw the world that his ideas would help make. He died in 1883, 34 years before the Russian Revolution, 66 years before the People's Republic of China, 84 years before Che Guevara's face appeared on 1 million posters in 100 countries. He was buried at Highgate Cemetery with those 11 mourners, in a grave that would eventually carry one of the most famous inscriptions in any cemetery in the world. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. He had written that sentiment himself in 1845. It was never published in his lifetime. It was added to his gravestone decades after his death. The grave has been vandalized repeatedly over the years and repaired each time. People make pilgrimages to it from around the world, leaving flowers, books, small notes, some in reverence, some in anger or curiosity, some simply to stand there and consider what a human life can set in motion when the person living it commits everything they have to the question they think matters most. That question, whether the cost is worth it, whether a life consumed by an idea is a life well spent or a life squandered, is one Marx never seemed to ask himself. Maybe that's what made him capable of doing what he did. Or maybe it's the part of him that's hardest to admire. Karl Marx sat down in January of 1848 and wrote, "The world was different after that, is different still, right now, in ways that trace directly back to that apartment in Brussels and that dark green pamphlet.